the uninitiated conversation sort of track, like ready to go in your head?
Well, I think it's the conversation would be like, what's the sort of network of things? Sort of, at this point, we've got sort of like three buckets of conversation we do,
Okay.
right? We get the like Lady of Champion conversation, like the church begins, wilderness begin, a renewal begins in the wilderness.
Okay.
Okay, it's a thing. Um, and then there's the like, and then you can connect cell phones to that. But then there's like the dopamine culture thing, like
Sure.
that I gave to the Chamber of Commerce. Like, hey, we're concerned about the lender Chamber of Commerce award
Yep.
luncheon, right?
Yep.
Like, hey, we're worried about this. This is a big problem. Here's what we do. We need to give up the cell phones, do this thing, and replace it with these activities. Okay, that's another. Right. So the religious pitch, the like
The
non-religious pitch,
loss the
whatever.
loss of our youth.
Yeah, exactly. Save our civilization, bring back the front porch, like,
Yep.
fight for our town, okay, that thing.
Yep.
Um, and and then there's the like, hey, guardians of tradition. Like, here's the kind of education Plato said the guardians of the republic needed.
Yep.
Fast from bad things in the culture, gymnastic, poetic, and then you go into philosophy. Like, oh, okay, all right, that's sort of the liberal arts kind of way. And any
Mm,
one of those things can sort of work. This one's very specifically Catholic.
sure.
And then the last one you can do is sort of the stump speech of higher education is going to hell in a handbasket.
Yep.
It's broken, it's bad. Um, we're here to save it. Um,
Right, but that's not going to appeal to people to be like, I never went to college, and my
right.
dad,
Yeah, exactly. Right.
my dad picked rocks and raised us six kids on a ranch and a higher education. They can go to hell.
Right. But then you sort of be like, yeah, no, I hear you, and that needs to happen. But think of how many thousands and thousands of people are wasting their time in college, uh, and these other institutions. Like, we need like just like the top cream of the crop to come and devote themselves to being able to be leaders in this movement. So yes, by all means, many a folk could be a coal miner in West Virginia and do a great life. But if you feel like you're one of the, a Marines ad, one of the few, the proud, the Marines who's ready to, take back the Republic, right? We need you here, right? We're the only one equipping this. Well, you can do, various things. But for none of those things,
Mm,
no one wants to get you on Rogan or Carlson or something just for an infomercial. They want to have a conversation about the themes behind it. So we can talk about
sure.
like why higher education is broken,
Right.
or why dopamine culture is bad and what to do to fix it. But
Yep.
you can't just give a stump speech.
Bishop, right.
Like,
Here, I'm going to talk for the
I
next
got a
90
30-minute
minutes.
infomercial on Seth Rogen. That's not gonna.
Oh, that'd be fun though. You just swing your mic just a little bit closer, just so yeah,
All
somewhere
right.
in that line. Yeah,
Okay.
that's perfect. Um, why, why do you feel like one of these groups has not just latched on to the little college in Lander and said, that's the place? Is there too much competition?
Yeah.
Is it there's because we have things that appeal to those different groups, it's then hard for one of those groups to pick you as like, we're totally aligned with you.
Yeah, I think that may be so like if you get excited about Catholic education,
Hmm.
you're like, okay, I want authentic Catholic education. You're going to go Newman Guide. But then
Right,
there's 23 schools, right?
right, right.
Um, if you get excited about liberal arts education, integrated liberal arts education, all right, okay, or now we got a smaller pool, right?
Sure.
You have like Christendom, UD, St. John's, THC,
Hillsdale.
Thomas More, right? A bit of Hillsdale there. You're like, okay, well, I like that. Now, what's distinctive there? If you get excited about like, hey, we're taking on the legacy higher education establishment and upturning carts. We're not doing the federal funding thing. We're doing the
Hmm.
again. You got Hillsdale, you got Grove City, you've got Christendom in some way. You've got another group of schools. University of Austin, down in Texas, right? There's this sort of model of higher education is broken, and we're gonna fix it.
Yep.
So okay, those are all great. Wilderness, okay, that's our niche, right? Because say the wilderness, but we need you don't just come to college because you love wilderness, right? We need to couple wilderness with these other messaging pieces, right? And to so I think it's a distinctive voice. It's just a matter of sort of rising above. You think, well, here's the stats that I'm currently thinking of. Current to a recent study, there's roughly 100,000 weekly mass going 18-year-olds in the country.
100,000 weekly mass going. Okay.
Okay. There are roughly 20,000-ish total enrolled undergrads at Newman Guide colleges.
What happened to the other 80?
Right. And that's total enrollment. That's not just freshman enrollment, that's total enrollment. So there's this huge gap
Right.
between weekly mass going, and that weekly mass going population is, you hear all about the birth dearth and the population demographic cliff that we're coming to. That population isn't shrinking.
Is
That
not.
population is going to grow.
Right.
So in the next 5 years or so, that population is going to grow by like 45%. So there's a space there. Now, all of those probably not all going to college.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe a number of those are first generation, haven't gone to college yet, need to convince them to go to college. Maybe they're immigrant families, maybe something's going on there. But a number of those are going to go to colleges with good Newman centers or, something like that. Some are going to go to, you get like devout Catholics to go to Texas A&M because they got such a dynamic, focused Newman Center or something like that, right?
Actually, so that's what I was going to ask you about specifically. I mean, are Newman centers actually hurting your cause?
So I think 30 years ago, 20 years ago, I think people would say, yeah, go to a Catholic school, one of these, special Catholic schools, or go to a place with a dynamic Newman Center.
That was the advice
That was the
on the
advice,
street.
right? It
Okay.
made sense, right? You go to some place like, Texas A&M, it's the largest Newman Center in the country, and there's like,
Yeah, 60,000 enrolled students at Texas A&M, I
and then
think.
there's huge numbers of baptisms at the Easter Vigil every year,
Right.
right? Or you've got like Lincoln, Nebraska, UNL has got, huge investments in their Newman Center, and they're doing great things. And you're like, well, look, like I'm gonna be a Longhorn or be a Cornhusker or gonna do one of these, I get all the joys of the college experience, and I get Newman Center, great focus missionaries. And I think the thing we have to realize is, yeah, that's mission territory. That's not where you go to grow in your faith and be steeped in your faith. Newman centers are like lifelines, life preservers, or evangelization centers,
Mm.
but they don't actually replace a Catholic formation throughout all that. But for a long time, we thought they did, and it's only as we're seeing like the utter bizarreness of what's out there
In the classroom,
in the
not
classroom,
in Newman
not
centers.
exactly in the classroom and in the student life culture.
Mm. Yeah.
So yeah, in this Newman Center, there's this harbor of sanity, or University of Madison, or Duluth. You got Father Mike Schmitz there in your Duluth Newman Center, and like, wow, okay, all right, you get dynamic and prayer and like all this great things going on. But then you go into the classroom and you're saying there's no such thing as a woman, and maybe we should all be Marxists, and then you go into the student culture, and the expectation is you just get drunk as a skunk every weekend, and there's not more. Okay, so yes, it's good to have an island of sanity in the middle of that, but that's not going there to receive a comprehensive formation.
Okay, so we were talking briefly about a severe mercy before we went live. So
I didn't
he
realize we were live yet. Okay, great.
we're live. We are live, right? Okay, we're live.
Well, I turned this on when you started asking the questions about, yeah, like what would you want to say about WCC essentially?
Gotcha. Was it before or after I called Michael Knowles a good-looking son of a bitch?
It was after.
But we got it in now, so we're
Apologies to Michael Knowles. I really enjoy your work. So in a severe mercy, he talks about his Oxford days, right? So they get married, they have various adventures, and then they go to Oxford. Would you agree with the idea that, okay, in the late 40s, early 50s, when they were there, you could go to a ostensibly secular place and have basically an education that was liberal and formative to the soul. And then even though the Christianity bits were on the side, you could still have the two basically in cooperation with each other. And what
Yeah.
you're saying is now is that if you're at most universities, that sort of amicable cooperation is no longer possible.
Yeah, so I'm inclined to say that. I want to say that. The thing that makes me hesitant about saying whether you could do it in the 40s or 50s is I was reading the memoirs of the president of Fordham University. He was president of Fordham like in the World War II era,
Okay.
right? Um, and he'd gone to Georgetown in like 1909 when there were 120 students, and they had this great intensive Jesuit liberal arts education. And even then, he made an interesting point. He said, you know, anytime you can choose an authentic Catholic education, you choose it at whatever level there is. So I said, if you can choose it at K through 8, choose it at K through 8. If there's a Catholic high school you can go to, you go to the Catholic high school. And if there's a Catholic college you go to the Catholic college. Now, it may be the case that that's always true, right? That integrated Catholic education is always true. But the distance between an integrated Catholic education and a classical liberal education at a university has intensified over the years. So that he might say, like, look, Oxford's great. And he even talked about his own time at Oxford and how marvelous and wonderful it was, but how it was important to be in sort of a Catholic group and have Catholic professors even while you were at Oxford. You know, he did it as a Jesuit at Oxford, and it was really important. Um, so maybe he'd say, like, no, that was great to do, and there's that. And then if you can replicate that at the Catholic level, marvelous. But as time's gone on, that distance between a solidly Catholic integrated education and, hey, we're holding the line. Even now, I'm not having been at Oxford, I can't speak to it definitively, but at least some of the papers and things coming out of Oxford seem a long way away from C.S. Lewis talking about Oxford, right? Or Cambridge or whatever.
Yeah. Because he
He did
spent
both.
time at both.
Yeah.
Right. Yes, I remember Professor Lewis saying that when he was at Oxford and they had the enrollment, the book of enrollment, right? Um, he was able to flip back, it was, I'm going to suppose, 50 pages or what have you, and find Lewis's name in the same book that he was signing
Right.
to be an alum. I was like, wow, the history here
Yeah.
is really heavy. But what you're saying is, would would what is happening at Oxford intellectually cause Lewis to spin in his grave?
Yeah, and though Lewis even seems to think, right, that the future of education is certainly in the hideous strength of things. Like the future is really dangerous. It's getting worse and worse and worse.
Yes. Because each thing is becoming more and more allied with its sort of sponsor or its patron,
Yes.
right? They're
Yes.
becoming less and less separable.
Right. Right. And there's something seems to be very worthwhile to think about in that regard. And I think that's certainly what's happening even for the alum out of these Ivy Leagues when they're looking at the protests going on campus and the anti-Semitism and the various bizarre insistences on DEI and some of the various ideologies that are there. They're thinking, whoa, that's not what it was when I was there, even in the 80s.
Even in the 2000s.
Even in the 2000s, right? That there's this intensification of the ideas and the consequences of the ideas being borne out in the university now that is bizarre.
Right. Do you think what happens in universities today is sort of to think of an image from that hideous strength with the head, right? I think it's described as ideation drawn to a super potent level, but again, the image in the novel, well, the reality in the novel is that it's just a head kept alive by artificial means. I think what Lewis may have been referring to, and I'm wondering if you agree with it, is the idea that something could be so isolated from the rest of human experience and so isolated from the rest of reality that it is allowed to flourish along one very narrow channel, but it's not really flourishing because of the very narrowness of the channel along which it runs. Right. I mean, by analogy, like, people say, what do they say about bodybuilders? Like they look great on the outside, but they're dying.
Yeah.
Like the muscles are great, but the rest of the body is so sick. Do you think what we find in the universities today is basically that on the intellectual plane?
Yeah. Well, so I've been in the last few days, we've had several interview requests and comments solicited about the death of Pope Francis
Mm-hmm.
and questions about Pope Francis's legacy. And one of the things that's striking to me there is that, in fact, Francis's legacy on education is precisely the thing, is saying precisely the thing you say. That Francis talked about education over like 80 times in the course of his major encyclicals.
Mm.
He wrote last summer, at the end of last summer, wrote a letter about the need for seminarians to read literature and at various points. And he has these two themes that he hits over and over again. And the one theme is this phrase that he coined in Laudato Si, the technocratic paradigm. And the technocratic paradigm is, in a certain sense, him taking the idea of John Paul II's culture of death and talking about it even more intensely, a kind of intense, rational, scientific, isolated from the rest of integrated human living,
Mm.
and focusing on efficiency and progress and various things, and doing it maybe especially via technology, the technocratic paradigm. And this is where the solution is. And there he says, and this is the fundamental backbone of the education system that we have now. And he says, and it's utterly corrupt. And we need to basically blow it up and start over. That this sort of precisely the point you were saying, that we sort of have studied in this mode, this what he calls the enlightenment mode, the idea that there's only one kind of knowing, which is knowing for the sake of power,
Mm-hmm.
and that knowing for the sake of power exalts the individual human will over the good of the community. And he's like, all right, that's what the education system feeds now. And we need to stop that. And that will keep propagating because there's certainly excellences like, wow, I can figure out how to understand how atoms work so well that I can make the most powerful bomb in the history of mankind.
Mm.
Like, okay, that seems like the bodybuilder image, like incredible knowledge while
Incredible
lots of
progress and
death.
sophistication.
Yeah.
Yeah, but in the service of what?
Yeah.
Yeah, and what do you leave behind
Right.
in order to make that progress?
So what Francis says is you need an education rooted in what he'll call integrated humanism. And it's not always clear what Pope Francis means and are all the consequences of what that integrated humanism is. But in education and integrated humanism, that's going to prevent just an isolated head.
Yes.
A focus, he'll say in his last encyclical that he wrote, a focus on the heart,
Mm-hmm.
which sounds very much like C.S. Lewis's concern for an education of the chest, of
Mm.
this integrating
Lest we find ourselves in a society of men without
men
chests.
without chests, just isolated heads.
Mm.
And of course, that's going to wreak havoc. Yeah.
Right. That's interesting. The immediate image for me has always been men without chests are those without strength or conviction, but it's more on the side of strength, like the muscle,
Mm-hmm.
right? But I forgot about the heart. Yeah, men without chests. Yeah, they would have no home. They would have no home for their heart.
They have no loyalty. They have no love. They have no sense of other things that move them. The only sort of tool they have for analyzing is this efficient? Does this advance the bottom line? Does this advance my technology or my question or progress?
Mm.
It's pretty dark stuff.
Sure. Is it different in kind from the complaints that could have been leveled against industrialists of the early 20th century who slowed the clocks to get more hours out of their workers, who locked the doors so that workers could not leave early, who insisted upon the worker, largely poor immigrants living in cities,
Right.
people who were who were not yet enfranchised. Like, is the
Yeah.
accusation that could be leveled against the modernist the same accusation that might be leveled against an industrialist of 120 years ago? Like, has something changed because of the digital revolution that was not similarly represented by the industrial revolution?
So in some ways, I think you're right. Probably it's the same in kind, right? That sort of focus on profit and various things.
Hmm.
I think Francis would note there's a couple of things that are distinctive. One, and this maybe already have been true in the Industrial Revolution, but less so.
Mhm.
Everyone sort of buys into the myth that this is good for them. Right? With the Industrial Revolution, if you were the child laborer, like, okay, this is what I got to do. I'm stuck. I'm kind of a slave to the man. Um, Whereas for Francis, his big concern is like even the people who are winning the game, so to speak, are slaves to the game.
Ah, they can't play another game.
Yeah, and everyone's convinced that this is the sheer measure, and we all want to get the newest technology. Why? Because it's the newest technology, which will be helpful.
Hmm.
It will make things better. Um, why do we need to have? So his favorite complaint, air conditioning, or one of the things he complains about, right? Why do we need to have air conditioning in South America?
Who's complaining about air conditioning?
He's noting he did great for years in South America without air conditioning. Um, Granted, you might need it in certain extreme moments or something.
Sure.
He's like, yeah, but like we sat on our porch, we waved fans, we hung out together, and then now we're like, oh, I can do air conditioning, so no one sits on their porch anymore,
Hmm.
right? And then his concern about what the fossil fuels do and various things, we can debate whether that exact analysis of the resources is the right one. But
Sure.
his main concern about, look, no, everyone's convinced I'm going to do air conditioning. Why? Because it's comfortable and it's the newest thing. If it turns out that air conditioning is actually creating a hole in the ozone layer, oh well. That was not a question we had when we decided that we were going to opt into air conditioning, or we all drink whatever the case is, right? That we're in a certain sense allured by the newness of it and allured by the efficiency of it. Now we can work harder. Now we can be more efficient. We don't need to take the summer off. We're going to
Right.
make more
Right.
money, right? We're going to
Yeah.
do these things. Now,
No,
again, I don't want to get on the air conditioning bashing thing, but just the note he's making of like the allure is not because, man, I'm miserable, so I know the Industrial Revolution is bad because I'm a slave worker.
hmm
It's so much better off. And as a result, I'm making decisions or habituated to making decisions where the value I'm making is this efficient? Is this good? I'm not thinking about it in terms of community. I'm not thinking about it in terms of forming friendship, what's good for my family. Uh, it's just like, hey, the future's here. I need to get on board with the future, and here we go.
And here we go. Yeah, bump it down to 65.
Yep.
Yeah.
Or my kids all need smartphones. Why? Well, because that's what everyone's going to have. Or whatever the
Right. I
case
don't
may
want to be
be. I don't
behind.
want to be behind. And
Mm.
because progress is a kind of code name for good,
Mm.
I'm going to go. And then if I get left behind, well, those are the people who are left behind by the necessary wheel of history as it moves forward or something, right? It's going to crush some. And so we're not concerned for the vulnerable or the weak or the workers who get left behind. And certainly we hear that now in the complaints about the machinists and the question about, hey, we outsourced all these things, the global concern and the move toward digital, and we've left this wake of Appalachia. Now we've got the Vice President of the United States complaining about the devastation wreaked in
Yes.
Appalachia by this move, and no one was concerned about it because it was progress.
Mm. Yes. Yes. That John Prine song. Yeah. And they'll write it all down as the progress of man.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yes.
Exactly.
Speaking of yeah. Yes. I remember that distinctly. I was privileged to hear that sung by a group of musicians, several of whom were from that area, and had been trained. They were trained musicians, but had probably begun their music journey singing some of these Appalachian music as just sort of part of their culture before they received any musical training, and the power and the rawness of what they brought to it, I think will stick with me forever. Yeah. Yeah. Daniel Quinn writes in Ishmael that to summarize, he believes that the agricultural revolution actually is a sort of Babel, in that man gained security at the price of living within the sort of the palm of God, right? Where God sometimes provides and God sometimes allows want and poverty, but there was a peace. There was a peacefulness in that experience and that way of life, and that the agricultural revolution was a insistence that we have the option to not live within the palm of God. I wonder if we could say that every revolution that we've had since has been some version of that, be it the digital revolution, the industrial revolution, the printing revolution,
Yeah.
some measure of I am going to wrest control.
Hmm. Yeah, and in some sense, the image of the Tower of Babel is precisely that, right? Like,
Hmm.
whoa, this cool new technology. We can make bricks.
Sure.
Now we're going to exalt ourselves up to heaven. Like we have peaked. We're basically gods.
Yes.
You're like, okay, so it doesn't take much to get us pretty excited about the technocratic revolution, right?
Right. Right. Bricks. Now we think we're God.
Yeah, that's right. You're okay.
We really made a leap there.
We're easily impressed with ourselves. Ooh, Joe Stack brick.
Yeah.
God, right?
Right.
Okay,
Right.
all right, yeah. Um, yeah, I think what Francis would say is distinct about the technocratic paradigm
Hmm.
is that even when we see there's a mistake, our solution is more tech.
Hmm.
We're seeing this. You see all the ads now for, are you addicted to your smartphone?
I am.
And then it says, therefore, buy brick or buy this new app or, we have a technological solution to help you with your addiction to tech.
Sure.
And you're like, okay, interesting, interesting. Or I saw someone promoting like, all right, young men are increasingly addicted to porn. Like that's a real problem. They don't know how to have human relationships. So we've created avatars with AI to help young men enter into real relationships to break away from their porn addiction. Okay, okay, there's something maybe well motivated here, but it's this doubling down of, hey, we're not in the palm of God. We fixed the problem. Oh, there's a problem. We'll add some more tech, and it will be okay. Uh, Wendell Berry complains about this all the time, right? That there's the nature of the problem. Like, oh my goodness, we have been farming in this way, and it's depleting the soil. Great. Let's inject more chemicals into the soil, and it will help the soil. Okay. Okay.
Right.
Right.
Right. We're low on sulfur and nitrogen. Here's a product
Right.
to restore sulfur and nitrogen balances to your soil.
As opposed to, should we have stepped back and said, was there something we were doing wrong with the way we were farming
Right.
that depleted the soil? It's no, the only way forward is
Another iteration
Right. which
of
maybe
action. Yeah.
contributes to your sense of like, why is every successive revolution like a further moving in this way out of the palm of it? Because every revolution needs another revolution.
Right.
A cycle.
Yes. I've mentioned this on the cast before, but I had a great experience this January in Belize following around this agricultural teacher who was also a farmer, and he was showing me the different programs they had with swine and chickens and corn and crops, all these great things. But he said, and it was a great summation of his project, was that he said, if I can try to teach my students that they can farm in rhythm with a natural cycle of life, and that at no point is it absolutely necessary to insert some agricultural product, right? Some industrial process into that seasonal cycle, then I will have done my job. Right. Beyond all the details of when the sows come into heat
Right.
and when the chickens should be on pat, all of these details need to be learned. But his central idea was very simple.
Which again is very, very Wendell Berry-esque, right? Barry complains about the fact that we now talk about food factories.
Mm-hmm.
He says a factory. Well, I'm listening to Wendell Berry essays read by uh, Ron Swanson.
That is delightful.
Yeah, right.
Is that a thing?
Well, yes, it's a thing, right?
Oh.
So what's the actor's name that actually plays Ron Swanson?
Oh, I don't know.
Anyway,
Right.
but
But the important thing is that it's Ron Swanson.
reading Wendell Berry. So every time I go to quote a Wendell Berry, I just hear Ron Swanson saying it. So there you go. But
Right. It's Nick Offerman, but yeah.
There you go. Right. No, it's Ron Swanson, right?
But it's Ron Swanson.
That's the important thing. So what Barry has this point is that the problem with a factory is sort of by definition no place.
As in, it could be anywhere.
It could be anywhere.
Mhm.
And it could be at any time.
Ah,
Right? There's the factory sort of by its nature is not measured by anything else other than the demands of profit and what the factory can pull off.
and its effective output.
Right. And so to talk about agricultural factories, food factories, right, is precisely to take the opposite view from the Belize agricultural thing, where like what we're fundamentally doing is responding to a nature, a pre-existent reality, and working in harmony with it.
Mm.
The other image Barry gives is the difference between paths and roads.
Ah,
He says paths, paths are a kind of ritual of memory with the landscape.
hmm.
When you follow a path, you're sort of responding to the contours of what's there.
Sure.
A road,
Right. It goes around this way
right?
because that farmer is very persnickety about his land.
Yeah, right, exactly.
Right. And right. It contains the culture of memory that all the children in the neighborhood know. Stay away from Farmer Johnson.
Right. And then it's not going to get this too close to the creek because that gets into swamp. It's going to avoid swamp. And it's not going to go steep up the road because that's exhausting. So it's going to sort of go with the curves and it's going to wander. And that's how you get there. A road, Barry says, the road, however, is a kind of act of violence. The best kind of road changes the landscape. So you can go straight as fast as you can for the sake of efficiency, profit, and pleasure. All right, and so that I was thinking of that as we were driving across I-80 previously.
Right. The most cursed road in America.
No, but their I-80, in some sense, is striving to it doesn't matter where you are; it all feels like I-80.
Right.
And to the extent that it doesn't feel like I-80 failed.
Yes.
Right? It's not. Yeah.
Yeah. Yes, I remember having a very similar thought in on the other 80s, the 81 and 85 over on the East Coast, right? Where it's like you could be in Thornton, New Jersey, or you could be in Erie, Pennsylvania, but the rest stops are exactly the same. It's the identical McDonald's with the identical Taco John's with the identical bathrooms.
Yep.
It's you could put someone down in that place and they wouldn't know where they are.
And we want to make that as flat as possible, as many lanes as possible to let you go as fast as possible because the path is irrelevant. What matters is you get from point A to point B.
Sure.
With as little recognition of the surrounding demands of nature and landscape as possible.
Yes. Yes.
that again is like a factory, right? This model, right? It is antithetical to the way your agriculture professor believes is talking about what agriculture is for.
Right. Right. Yeah, where you say like this is the corn we grow here in Belize. If you go just a mere 40 miles, you're going to find, well, over there in Guatemala, they grow a slightly different variety.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
It's like, and you know where you are
Yep.
because of the corn.
Yep. Yep. I remember my aunt telling me this about the cattle in Wyoming. She goes, well, because the grass that we get in Wyoming, there's a kind of protein in it, and it gets a certain development to the beef in Wyoming, which is different than you get from beef in Texas. And so now Texans send their cattle up to graze a little bit in Wyoming so they can get this. And then we put all of our cattle over to the stockyard in Nebraska, so they, then to level it out.
Sure.
So by the time I'm eating a cow, I'm not like, this is Wyoming beef. I'm like, this is a cow that was mooing in Nebraska. Now it's safe.
And now, thank God, it's on my plate.
Right, right, exactly, right.
Wow.
Factory.
Right. Is the liberal arts a specific remedy to some of these ills, or does it happen to be just allied with
Yeah.
the other side?
Yeah. I
Like,
think
would Wendell Berry say, man, you got to know your astronomy?
right, right, right. Would it be better?
Maybe he would.
Yeah. Well, Wendell Berry himself, right, has a degree in English from Columbia.
Mm-hmm.
And in a way feels like he repudiated it to go work back on his own farm in Kentucky while being a writer.
Mm-hmm.
But in another way, right, his ability to reflect on what he's doing as a farmer was precisely because of his literary formation.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Right. If he had never left the farm, he
right,
couldn't have been Wendell Berry.
right. Yeah, we're not quoting Wendell Berry if he's just a farmer in Kentucky doing the thing. And in fact, you probably couldn't be a farmer in Kentucky doing the thing because you can't actually make a living in the current economy just doing the farming thing.
Right.
You've got to publish a whole lot of books.
Right,
It's
right.
kind
Who's
of
the
a
guy who
side
wrote
job.
like Shopcraft as Soulcraft?
Yes.
No, what is that?
Shopcraft is soul
Shop
craft.
class.
Shop class
Shop-
is soul craft.
Right.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. Right. Where you read the book and you're like, this is great. And then you think, yeah, but he couldn't have been just a motorcycle mechanic.
Right.
He kind of has to publish.
Right. Right. And Barrett even says, he goes, look, if you're trying to make it as a farmer, it's probably not going to work. Situation, right? You need it. But he also thinks it's really important to have people. So in some sense, we're it's going back to Jefferson's view. It's good to have the gentleman farmer,
Yes.
the liberally educated person who's able to appreciate. And so, to the extent that the liberal arts teaches you a knowledge of community, teaches you a kind of self-reflection, teaches you a knowledge of place. To that extent, it seems like liberal arts is really well allied.
Mm-hmm.
But we need to be careful, right? Descartes and Bacon were great liberal artists, were schooled in the liberal arts, and then themselves declared that the goal of knowledge was to basically make roads.
Was to exercise the will of man over either nature or other men.
Right, right. And that our goal is now to master nature and make it work, right? Make factories that suck the most out of nature, right? So there's in some ways two very different views of liberal arts. In some sense, because of the difference of two very different views of freedom. Is freedom being in power, or is freedom being in natural relationship? And for Aristotle's entire ethics is predicated on freedom and friendship and all the rest is predicated on a relationship according to nature, according to the powers and the excellences that are inherent in your nature in response to the powers and excellences around you. But you could have a view of freedom is what Thrasymachus says in the Republic, which is the strong man wins.
Mm-hmm.
Strong man rules.
Be it the physically strong man or the rhetorically strong man.
Right. It's the strong man, right? And you could, and so a liberal. So going back to Francis, a liberal education that's only focused on a kind of intellectual formation can easily lend itself to uh, the Bacon approach, the road building approach, to the
Mm,
Thrasymachus approach. A liberal education that is focused on cultivating the heart as well as the arts of free, the arts of freedom, not just in terms of an idea, but it's coming from the heart. That seems to be well aligned with the thing we're talking about.
okay. Okay. Yes. Rhetoric appears to me to be the example par excellence of how someone could be given skills to suit his own Machiavellian ends.
Right.
But I suppose, in some sense, every one of the studies of the quadrivium and the trivium could be yoked to the service of power. Again, rhetoric
Right.
seems to me to be the one that stands out of like, oh yeah, that's really obvious. If you can move the opinions of others, you can gain power.
Yeah, certainly for Plato, right? That's the one he complains about the most. The worries about rhetorical education, right?
Yes.
Whereas it seems in some ways the Enlightenment revolution was saying, whoa, we could think of all knowledge like rhetoric. All knowledge could be a tool for power.
Ah,
Interesting.
okay. There's something in kinship between, whoa, we could split apart atoms as
Right.
a weapon, and we could turn the hearts and thoughts of men against them.
Right.
There's something akin in those two things,
Right.
which may not have been available to people in the Renaissance. Right, you couldn't turn lead into gold, and nuclear power was not available at the time.
But they wanted to.
But right. But wouldn't it be great?
Right.
Wouldn't it be great if we could turn lead into gold? Because ultimately, gold is a measure of power.
Right. Right. So that why do I study astronomy or natural physics? If I'm a Isaac Newton, at some level, because I want to turn lead into gold.
Sure.
Yeah.
Ooh. Ooh. It's a little scary.
It is. It is. Yeah, Socrates doesn't have to worry about this, right? Like, the thing for Plato is rhetoric.
Yes.
And then Aristophanes is making fun of the people who are studying natural philosophy and things. The problem with them is they're doing something that's worthless.
Mm-hmm.
You get the clouds and like the thinkery and like the utter bizarreness and disjunct of that, right? It's not connected to the city.
Right. Right. He's the one with the image of like, why are these men staring at the ground, studying the earth so closely?
Right.
Well, they want to understand the earth. Well, why are there butts in the air? Well, a minor in astronomy.
Yeah. That's right. That's right. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Whereas really in the alignment, we get to think, oh, this is actually power.
Ah,
This is
okay.
actually, and ultimately with the astronomy, right? That's sort of the crushing thing, right? That Galileo, like, hey, you know what? When things fall, they're making parabolas, right? That Galileo's thing of motion. And then Kepler, like, oh yeah, the study of astronomy. In some ways, it's just the study of falling rocks.
Mm-hmm.
And really Newton, especially making that moment. That when we're doing astronomy, we're not studying some celestial transcendent being, we're studying falling rocks.
Falling rocks.
And if we're studying falling rocks, at some point, we're going to be able to weaponize that.
Sure.
Now, Newton didn't do it, though subsequent satellite development and the space race and the various things, in a certain sense, you could see as a weaponization of Newton.
Right. But as soon as we made the intellectual shift from these are celestial bodies that have a form beyond beyond the orbit of Earth, beyond the ambit of Earth.
Right.
As soon as we said, "Oh, those are like us, falling rocks.
Right.
We deal with falling rocks. What if we can make those rocks fall the way we want to?"
Can I turn those into bricks?
Exactly. Right. Those are right. We're a long way from Dante.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Could I turn those into bricks?
Right.
Yeah. So at first we just understand them, but the problem with understanding them is that they start to look a lot like bricks.
Right. So this is not to say, no, we shouldn't actually understand that the laws of gravity help explain what's going on in the celestial motion. I'm not trying
Sure.
to say that,
No.
but just this inherent temptation,
Mm-hmm.
right? That the moment we get knowing that we think of it as for power.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Wow. Interesting. Okay, so there seems to me to be a way in which, all right, so you can have this liberal education, and then alongside it, you could be formed in your education of the Christian faith, and perhaps specifically the Catholic faith, but there are different
Right,
colleges
right,
doing the Christian thing,
right.
right? Um, what's what are your thoughts on like, okay, how does the Christian thing really uh, save save the liberal thing,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah, so say John Henry Newman gives this great homily on the Feast of Saint Monica,
Mm-hmm.
where he's precisely thinking about this.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and in a certain sense, he's sort of takes these two types, right? The type of the powerful intellectual. What Augustine was doing before he converted
Okay.
was pursuing rhetorical knowledge, knowledge for power. He was going to be a somebody in the empire. He went to Rome. He was teaching rhetoric, right? Like
He was going to be an influencer.
exactly, right? He studied for the sake of power. And in fact, Augustine learned from people who taught in a for the sake of power mode, which is why he hated studying Greek because they beat him if he didn't know the right answer. It was a power dynamic, right? So, all right, so Augustine. And then Monica, simple, boring, not exciting church lady Monica.
A
And
bead clutcher.
yeah. And Newman says, and this is the real problem, right? The real problem for the young men going to Oxford are they desire greatness. They want to be great and excellent and powerful. And they're doing that in the study of the Oxford halls, and they're studying the advances of science and mathematics and this. And then they go and they look at what church is doing, and church is a bunch of little old women holding beads. And it seems utterly antithetical to their desires for greatness. And he says, and so the challenge for Christian education is to let Monica form Augustine, to let people know that the formation of your character, the formation of your heart, is not sort of a parallel thing on the side where
Mm-hmm.
you have to fold your desire for excellence and sort of consent to hang out with the little old ladies.
Oh, okay. So where your desire for greatness has to be sort of disciplined by
Right.
some version of piety or
Right.
niceness.
Where you give up. You're like, clearly greatness has nothing to do with the church potluck. I ate whatever the casserole that Monica brought. Like, greatness is not a factor here.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so at a certain point, you're like, why do I care? Like, this is not satisfying. He said, and the real challenge of Christian education is to be able to marry this moral formation, the formation of the heart, with a desire to greatness and make it an aspect of greatness. That when I want to be great, and that's in the end what has to happen for Augustine,
Hmm.
is he has to become aware that actually this is a place where I can exercise my intellectual power and be satisfied, in fact, never overcome it. But that doesn't work if I'm thinking of intellectual power as like the thing I do for advancement.
Mm.
But he's first converted by Plato. He's first converted by the good of contemplation as such. And they say, oh, knowledge for its own sake. Oh, knowledge for its own sake leads to a conformity of life, and that's this glorious endeavor. So Newman says like this. So the challenge, because look, and the church is bad at this, right? The church lends itself to old lady potlucks. It's much
Because of
easier.
the easy humility
Yeah, well, and it's also
contained in
that's who goes to church, and the church is able to
ah.
settle with it, right? Like that's what it is, and you're okay with it, and like you
But
think,
even I mean, even Saint Stephen,
right?
right? Brought was it? It was Saint Stephen who brought forward what is the wealth of the church?
Oh, Lawrence, that's right.
Lawrence,
Yeah,
excuse me, thank
yeah,
you. It's well, it's the sort of people who show up at potlucks,
right, right. They're
and they might show up at potlucks empty-handed,
yeah,
and that's
yeah,
still the wealth of the church.
yeah.
Uh,
When St. Paul's writing the letter to the Corinthians, he's like, all right, let's just be honest, right? Like, you guys are not like the cream of the crop, worldly speaking. There weren't a lot of you that were rich or particularly smart or particularly gifted. Okay, can we be clear about that, right? That's sort of where we are. Uh, And Newman's saying, yeah, that's true. That's where we are.
Mhm.
Because it's easier, right, for the weakness of the world and the fools of the world to recognize the gospel in a sense. But the challenge is to marry that with this desire for greatness and education and the rest. He's like, this is an inherent tension. This is a real challenge. And the vocation of the Christian intellectual is to try to put those two things together. And when you're successful, you get a St. Augustine. When St.
Yes.
Monica actually forms your intellectual life, you get a St. Augustine.
Right.
Eh, But if you don't let St. Augustine get formed by Monica, you get a social climber influencer.
Right. But the tension is that Monica is never going to be Augustine.
No, she's not. And in fact, the only reason we know about Monica is because of what she did for Augustine.
Right.
But without Monica, there's no Augustine.
Yes. There's no conversion.
Right,
There's
right.
no conversion. Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting.
So Newman's whole point is that yeah, the Christian intellectual, right, the Christian intellectual life is these sort of disparate things.
Hmm.
And the church, in a certain sense, identifies more with Monica. The church is the mother,
Ah.
Oh.
right? So the church has to figure out how she accompanies her sons in their quest for greatness and in their study and the very things, but in a way that effectively forms their hearts. And that's going to involve a lot of tears, a lot of sacrifice, a lot of wailing. Um,
But it is not a work that can be ignored because that ambition, I guess I'll call it, like a horse that wants to run, it's going to run.
right.
So you can't ignore it and just say, well, just come to the potluck, just come pray the rosary with
Yeah.
me, just do these things. And for certain personalities, that just isn't enough to yoke to the spirit that they possess.
Yep. It is in another way a way of ignoring men with chests,
Ah,
right? It's sort of abandon. You have this like, no, we're just going to abandon that.
right, right.
I don't care about forming your courage and your desire for greatness. Like,
Mm,
put that away. It's
yes,
scary. It's dangerous.
it is
You
dangerous.
want to
Yeah.
make bricks? Don't do that because when you make bricks, bad things happen.
Okay.
But
Hmm.
that's not what we can do. We have to say, well, you got to make bricks.
Right. But the church needs a place for the El Cids, the
Yeah.
Charlemagnes,
Yeah.
the Shackletons, while also having a place and even a formation by the what was it, the Blue Mantle Society?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Right. Right. And there's going to be a point, right? Newman's like, yeah, you just got to admit, right? There's going to be times when you go there and you're going to be like, oh my goodness. So yeah, that's also part of it.
Right. Another pancake
Right.
breakfast.
Who am I sitting next to? Like that's also what Saint Paul and Saint James is concerned about, right? Saint James is like, hey, wait, Saint Paul as well. Like I get that the bulk of the folks at church are not the sharpest knives in the drawer, but what's worse is you complain about sitting next to them when you go to church.
That's the Christian challenge against the Greco-Roman idea of the Greco-Roman idea of virtue.
Right,
Right.
right. So there's the problem in Corinth, right? You got people who are coming, who are bringing their picnic baskets, and they're like nice picnic baskets. They got good wine. These people know the good life. And they sort of look over at, Tom the cripple, who's also at church, like, Tom's not going to appreciate this brie. Be wasted on Tom. I'll just eat this brie. And St. Paul's like, yeah, that's not an okay way to do
Mm.
Jewish potluck.
Yeah. Yeah. No, in Lander here we have to slide a plate of food over to Bruce.
Yeah, that's right.
Yes, Bruce on his bicycle.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. That's right. And that's hard, right? Because it's
Because it is wasted in some sense. Yeah.
this person will never.
He would have been
appreciate-
perfectly happy with Velveeta.
That's right. I could give him a chunk of Velveeta and a Diet Coke, and that guy is living the high life. There's no reason for me to pour this glass of whiskey and this
Yes.
particular fine cheese. He doesn't care.
Yes.
Yeah, but what matters is that you're not willing to share it with him.
Hmm.
So St. Paul doesn't say, no, it doesn't matter that you have good food. He also doesn't say, don't bring good food. just no. Part of it is you got to be willing to share it.
Right.
Mm.
So,
Wow.
man.
Yeah. That's challenging stuff.
Yeah,
That's a
so,
lot to
so
think about.
that's the challenge. I think that's where Newman just puts his finger on. That's the challenge of Christian education.
Mm-hmm.
Mm.
All right. It's the to be able to be like, I'm gonna be a great brick builder and not think that makes me a rival.
Mm-hmm. One tension that I feel from, I'm going to say specifically the Gospels, is that I hear our Christian brothers saying, like, oh, the Bible has something to say about everything. And I'm not saying it doesn't, but to me, what is often very stark about the Gospels is Christ's silence about a great variety of things, right? Like, people would love it if Christ had an opinion about technology, the sort of career you should have, the proper age gap between husbands and wives, right? People would love it if Christ had sayings about all of this stuff. But in fact, what often impresses me is the silence of Christ on certain topics. How do you reconcile that with the thoroughness of a particularly classical
Right.
liberal education, which says, yeah, we're going to be very, very thorough. There's a new area of knowledge, we're going to get into it.
That's great. Yeah, I was just thinking about this in a certain version of the challenge of Christ. Um, I watched with my daughters their first time seeing Mel Gibson's The Passion. My older daughters.
Oh.
Yeah, this Lent. Um, and there's that scene where Christ is building a chair,
Yeah.
right? And Mary comes in and he's like, "Yeah, I got this chair, and the rich man's gonna sit like this at the table," and she's like, "It doesn't make any sense." And it just struck me all of a sudden. I was like, "All right." So Aquinas, in his Christology, he argues that Christ knew all things, like, all things. So Christ could have built a chair or a lazy boy, right? Or Christ could have, uh, I was so it's putting these two things together. So Christ on the one hand, then I thought of Back to the Future. I think it's Back to the Future 2,
Hmm.
right? Where Biff discovers the time machine and he goes back in time and he gives his young self
The book.
the book,
The book, yes.
which has all of the sporting the victories, and then young Biff places
bets.
bets and then becomes like this super rich and powerful person. Like, so Christ could have done that.
Hmm.
Right? Christ could have, you know, gone over and mentioned to Pilate, "Hey, if you put your troops here, things are fine." And it could have quickly escalated, right? And this, so sort of your point, like he could have given us, like, he sort of knew everything.
Yes.
He could have pronounced on it to get to the point where, like, he was utterly successful.
Hmm.
Like, if you know everything and you play your cards right, you could end up as the advisor to the emperor decently well. If Biff can end
He
up
could
as
have-
a ridiculously rich person, Christ could have advanced decently well.
If Joel Osteen, yeah, can have a net worth approaching 700 million,
That's right.
then by golly,
Yeah, he could have done all right.
Christ could have been the first prosperity gospel devotee.
That's right. And then just think of the impact he could have had. Like,
Sure.
the books he could have put. Like, he could have done the printing press in 30 AD.
Yeah.
Life changing. Right.
Yeah.
Right. Anyway. And he did it.
Hmm.
And I was just feeling that, sort of the way you put the question, right? Was sort of how I was feeling, like that the weirdness, the disparity that he had all knowledge and, like, chose to make his big entrance on a donkey to Jerusalem.
Mm-hmm. Right. He could have flown.
Exactly. Like, look, a hang glider.
Yeah,
Not even an airplane, but a hang glider. Like,
Right.
and so what that means, yeah, precisely for your point about liberal education, the educated person who wants to, like, comment on all things
Hmm.
and have the right answer for all things. And seemingly, the thing that Christ says is actually all of that. Cool, do what you can. Great. That doesn't actually matter. Whether you build an airplane or not, whether you build a brick or not,
Hmm.
doesn't matter. What matters is you follow me.
Hmm.
And for Augustine, that was the real challenge, right? The realization that like what mattered was not solving the philosophical questions about God even, but what mattered was following Christ. And to that end, he could use all of his knowledge, right? He can use whatever else is necessary because I'm a human and I need to think about astronomy or I need to think about math or I need to think about for the sake of loving Christ better.
Hmm.
And if I'm the kind of guy that needs that to love Christ better, okay, well then by golly, I need to do that.
Ah, yes, yes, yeah. Chariots of Fire has, I think, a scene that kind of captures this. Like the Lord also made me fast.
Make me fast. And when I run, it glorifies God. Right?
Yes. Yeah.
I feel his power, right?
Right. And other people might too. Yeah.
Right.
But
That's
also me. Yeah.
yeah, sort of Augustine's point, right? Like, okay, yeah, some of us need to know history so we can talk about scripture, so we can love God better, or so other people love God better.
Right.
And so, sure, liberal education's good. And this is the hard point for the Christian, right? Because on the one hand, we want to say liberal education is good for its own sake.
That's kind of its brand.
Right, sort of the thing, right? Like, why is this good? Because it's good to know.
Mm.
I guess it's like, yeah, yeah,
But I knew all that stuff and I was still miserable.
right, right. That ultimately I know all of that stuff for the sake of loving him.
Hmm.
Which is it now Aquinas will come in and he'll be a little bit more dispassionate, not have the conversion to be able to nuance it a little bit more than Augustine does.
Hmm.
But I think Augustine's right. And then this is back to Francis de Lexinos, his last encyclical. That's the point he makes, right? Is that focus on loving God is actually the really important thing. And that if you're only focused on intellectual knowledge, disconnected from the loving of God, you missed it. Or if you think that just knowing is going to result in you loving God, you missed it.
Mm. Wow.
That's interesting. I've kind of like half thought about a lot of these ideas, but never had the words to put to them. Um, I I think there's a stereotype of like Catholic boys are told to kind of just sit around, let God do all the work. As long as you go to church on Sunday and you don't say any bad words, you're gonna be what God wants you to be. But then I think a lot of us are like, well, that sounds really boring, you know? So it's like we equate goodness and going loving God as being boring.
Boring.
And then, right, what you're
We
saying,
equate it with inaction.
yeah, yeah, yeah. But in reality, if you actually couple all of the talents, the gifts, the ambitions you have for Him, then your life becomes so much more exciting because then you're essentially using the gifts God gives you to magnify life, not for yourself, but for everyone and Him.
Yeah.
But we're never, that phraseology is hardly ever used.
No, no. And in
Yeah.
fact, right, if you go to Sunday school, what are you told? To sit there and be nice.
Yeah.
And you're in high school and you're like, yeah, that's not the guy who's going to get the date to prom.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry. Right? Like,
And then you
Letting go and letting God is gonna let me down.
yeah. Yeah.
And then you get resentful of God because you think God's the problem. If
Right.
you hadn't been following God, you would have been fun. And then, so people are like, well, why do I need religion? Like, what has that ever gotten me?
Right. And in fact, I see this in sometimes when we get really promising, brilliant, wonderful young men and women who come to Wyoming Catholic College who think because they've come to Wyoming Catholic College, they've necessarily given up any concern for greatness. Right? They're like, oh, I'm not going to make a lot of money. I'm not going to have a successful business career. I'm not going to have huge impact. I opted out of all of that so I could go to tiny little Wyoming Catholic College.
Mm,
And this is not all of them, right? But
sure.
you know, this perception that like, okay, because I didn't go to the Ivy Leagues, I chose the potluck. Wyoming Catholic College is kind of the potluck of education,
Mhm.
where the blue-haired ladies are there serving me casseroles or something.
Anyone can get in.
All right,
Everyone's welcome.
yeah, I've chosen that.
We're all very friendly.
We're really nice, and I know good things are going on. There may be really good food at the potluck, but like, it's not like a fine dining establishment,
No
right?
Michelin star was awarded to
Yeah,
any
right,
potluck spread.
right. Whereas the irony is like what's there on the table at the metaphorically speaking, at the Wyoming Catholic College table are like the finest wines and the best cheeses, but they're in some ways a better education and better things than you would get at one of the legacy higher eds.
Mhm.
But seemingly, I've come here thinking I'm coming to the potluck. In a certain sense, it's like the guy that played the violin at the New York subway. He was the concert
Hmm. Yes.
violinist.
Concert pianist, or
And
excuse me, concert violinist.
people
Yeah.
had paid hundreds of dollars to go listen to him the next night,
Yes.
and everyone's just like walking by him.
Right. Right. Yeah. He made like $58
Right.
the whole night.
And hardly anyone stops to listen to him,
Right.
right? Because he's over here, right? He's not
The
in,
context is all wrong.
he's at the potluck,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
so he can't be great.
Yeah.
And so I think that is a real challenge, right? Is precisely this thing that somehow there'll be ability to recognize, no, my desire for greatness is here, and I can leverage that in creative ways and do great things, and not think that I've sort of opted out of that because I didn't go to uh, one of the Ivies.
Mhm.
I want to ask you more about that. Let's take a quick break though.
Great.
Oh. If you would just, yeah, just pull the mic a little bit more in front of your face. Yeah. Hmm. Wow. So much to think about. I've been tracking AI to some degree. Do you feel that in your work as an educator and in education, do you think there's something specifically responsive to AI inside the liberal arts project?
Well, we talked about well, actually, this is, I was in Rome in December,
Okay.
and I had a meeting with the undersecretary for the dicastery for education and culture.
Mhm.
That is like the most like bureaucratic title, like undersecretary for dicastery. But for all of that, the Monsignor is just this lovely man, um, who's French chemist, got a master's in Harvard, now is a Monsignor at the Vatican. Like one of these kind of fellows. And he was talking about AI.
Uh-huh.
This before the Vatican issued their document about AI. And he said, look, he goes, AI. He's like, it only thinks what you put into it, right? It doesn't actually think. It's just advanced processing, and it
Hmm.
can process faster than we can, right? And he said, but AI needs a ballast. It needs a weight in the bottom. It's not. It will tip over easily, one way or the other. So the example he gave is that there's this AI system in France that's being used. Um, that if someone is terminally injured in a car accident in northern France, um, it's put into this database, and the AI instantly processes what are the available organs and who should get them, and gets them sent out rapidly, faster than any human mind can process, which is great because the longer you delay, the worse it is for the
Yeah.
organ,
Yeah.
right? He says, but the problem is AI only thinks about it in terms of the data points that have been put in. Was this person a smoker? Was he not a smoker? How old is he? Various things. And on that basis, the science says that there's never a moment for human reflection on who should get the organ. And it's put forward as this great success of AI in terms of medical processes, that there's no sentimentality that interferes. There's never a point um, where a man's able to, you're able to say like, yeah, but this guy's a father to like a newborn baby. Maybe we should give him the heart.
Hmm.
AI doesn't care about that. AI only cares about like relative scores on health,
Mhm.
and
You
time.
can make AI care about that
If you
some
put in the
way.
information, but even then you'd have to put it in as a quantitative
Yep.
weighing factor.
Yep. Which again would never really be prudence.
It's right. Yeah, so prudence never enters in.
Mhm.
And he said, so what you need, since you need the humanities, you need the humanities to provide ballast,
Hmm.
provide weight, to provide a kind of, in a sense, what Francis ends up saying in the AI document, you need the heart to come in at some point.
Hmm.
And he says, and that's only going to happen not when you're like, I need to get a better and better AI system, but I need to make humans capable of using AI well.
Wow.
So we're not saying don't get a better AI system, but we're saying we need to make humans that can use this tool well. And that's what the liberal arts education is for.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. There was, to me, a somewhat misguided celebration of the mistakes of early AI. Ah, six fingers.
Right.
Right. Ah,
It will
no
never
depth,
be as good.
no depth of field.
Right.
It'll never be as good. Like, buddy, like, do you see the first airplane?
Right. Right. Yeah, you realize how this ends, right? The vaunting over the mistakes in the early, yeah, this is not going to go
This
upward.
never, yeah, this never works.
Right.
However, I think it needs to be paired with a realization that, okay, the Wright brothers to the F-16 is unbelievable.
Right.
The F-16 to the F-22, basically the same amount of time, is okay, real progress.
Right.
But there's a way in which some of our technologies explode in their progress, in their use, and then kind of slow down to this basically
Right.
gradual creep. I think we see that in medicine. I think we've seen that in flight. I think
Automotive.
automotive. Right. Yeah, exactly. The Model T to the 69 Mustang. Whoa.
Right.
But the 69 Mustang to the 99 Mustang,
Yeah.
Might have got backwards there.
it might have gone right.
Right.
According to some, it's backwards. So, yeah. So I will say, though, so it's like I don't want people celebrating the fact that AI still has the six finger problem or the vague hand problem because actually it even in the last 6 months it seems to have solved much of that.
Right.
I'm still a little bit worried about the uncanny valley problem of a lot of AI imagery. It's like you look at it and it's like sort of fascinating in its creepiness,
Right.
right? It's like, oh, okay, wow, they got all the flesh tones correct, and actually, whoa, they got all the number of fingers correct. So they solved those technical problems. Why is it still unsettling?
Right.
Why does it still seem somewhat both soulless and weirdly conscious?
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm talking mostly of the images.
Yeah. I don't know if I should say this on air or not. I'm going.
Oh, now you got to, you know.
Scotch has been good. No, I feel a bit about AI imagery
Mhm.
the way I feel about um, a certain kind of LDS art.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
You know, and again, I don't know why,
Hmm.
but that same thing that there those. I remember going to a high school speech and debate tournament in Alta, Utah, and then in the seminary wing of the high school, there's all these paintings that, in a sense, are religious art, but odd.
Hmm.
but not because they have too many fingers or something, but there's just
Sure.
something odd.
Yeah.
And I have that. I haven't articulated why I feel it's odd, but I feel that same, yeah, the uncanny valley note with AI, sort of how I felt looking at this LDS art when I was
Right.
a 16-year-old in
Right.
Alta, Utah.
Right.
Yeah,
Yeah. There's no soul to it.
it's very strange.
It is very strange. Yeah. I don't know. Right. And I don't know if AI can pass that because what's the technical problem to be solved? It's just weird. Doesn't feel right. Um, I mean, obviously there's all sorts of AI imagery that's just goofy, right? You type in, a picture of a woman in court, right? And she's okay, so it produces that, and she's got like her hand on a book, but she's also sitting behind the counsel chair, like which never happens in a courtroom.
Right.
So it's just like, oh yeah, that's goofy. Um, but at the same time, you just you wouldn't want to turn your back on such an image because in a weird way, it is also watching you.
Yeah.
Is the feeling gives to me.
So someone pointed out to me, and they said, "Well, look, it's in some ways it has to deal with the CGI problem,
Okay.
which is interesting, right? CGI, you feel like there's the early CGI that was a little bit clunky, and then there was this moment when CGI really came into its own,
Sure.
and now you feel like you see CGI in a show, and it's a little bit cartoony.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And you're like, how did we go backwards?
Yep.
And the answer is, at least this person was telling me that, well, no, the answer is actually it didn't go backwards. Market research determined that we got a better reaction from cartoony CGI than we did from doubling down on the super realistic CGI.
Ah.
That there's better viewer engagement in this way.
Okay. Interesting.
And so I kind of wonder about that with AI, is that when we're dealing with real human art, there's a kind of communion between the perception of reality that the artist has and the perception of reality that the viewer has, and there's this kind of communion that happens,
Mm-hmm.
this shared mimetic experience.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're AI, there's not that communion. That the measure is the technocratic paradigm. What sells, what generates clicks, what generates fascination.
Mm-hmm.
And it may be that what generates fascination is in fact not the same thing
Oh,
as like satisfying, restful art.
Hmm.
That the uncanny valley, in fact, may be a feature of AI, not a bug.
so it's like you're looking at the creepy painting on the wall because you're trying to find out why it's creepy.
Right.
You almost
Stare at
can't
the
look
wall.
away.
Yeah.
Right. And now you're going to go and try to generate an image to figure out why you can't work away. It generates more engagement,
Hmm.
a different kind of engagement than sitting in rapture before the Sistine Chapel or something.
Mm-hmm.
But in fact, the reality is most people, when they go to the Sistine Chapel, don't sit in rapture before it. They take a quick glance. They say if they've seen the Sistine Chapel, and they go on.
Right. They say I've been there. Yeah. That's a good point. When I see some of these AI imagery, I do stare at it. I'm like, what is going on? But the problem for me is that AI imagery is the first time I've seen an image that gives me the same feeling as I have in my nightmares. It's like, oh, I recognize that
Hmm.
that's something from a bad dream.
Hmm.
And it's the same feeling. I swear. I don't know if I'm alone in this, but it certainly is the feeling I have.
Wow.
Yeah.
It's interesting. It's like it's really only people AI images. Like if I see an AI image of just like an ocean, it's like, yeah, it's not bad.
Water?
Yeah, just like water. It's like, okay, no
Okay.
stress. But if I'm just, did you find that too? Like if I have inanimate objects, I don't really find them creepy. I just find them
Hmm.
weird-ish.
I'll have to bear that in mind and look again. Yeah.
There's something about the AI landscape where I feel like the problem is the AI landscape is less shocking because I think most of the landscape photos that we see have already been adjusted with a kind of Photoshop AI.
Uh,
Right.
And so it's not as immediately
recognize.
recognizable because we've been sort of conditioned to say that's what pictures of nature look
That's
like.
what pictures of meadows look like.
Yeah.
Interesting. Someone challenged me the other day, though. They said, like, why, why are you not using AI in your writing? Right? It would save you so much time. And I said, well, my defense is what Flannery O'Connor said about writing is that it's in the editing that we find our voice. It's almost, that's where we find what we really mean. And I wouldn't want something artificial to dictate that for me. But then I realized, wait a minute, I go back to previous things I've written and copy and paste all the time, right? So in a certain way, you can make this argument that when I write, I'm copying and pasting previous work of my own. I'm sort of borrowing from my past intelligence in order to produce something quickly right now. Is AI so different in that it uses the past intelligence of the larger human population in order to produce something quickly for you right now? Are you not, in the end, really being just thumbing your nose at the work of other people just because it's not your own
Yeah.
and saying, well, I don't like AI? Well, wait, what you're saying is you don't like the work of other people. Like, oh, actually, now that you put it that way.
So this question struck me in the new way that the search engines work.
Oh,
So if I Google something, what I get is I don't get first and foremost a list of uh, web pages. I get the AI summary.
mm-hmm.
Um, that's really interesting, right? Because on one hand, it's kind of helpful, especially if I'm like looking up a basic fact,
Right.
right?
Right.
Like what should I cook this roast to, or
Yes.
for how long should I cook this in the Instant Pot?
How important is the catalytic converter?
I get boom, I get a nice, great summary, and like I get it. Like that's really all I care about, right? But the problem is, it does that for any question I Google, right? So I Google, um, what was Pope Francis's position on technology? And instead of getting a series of articles or links to things that Francis said about technology,
Mm-hmm.
I get a nice 4 sentence summary from Copilot or whatever the AI engine is that tells me this is how I've summarized Pope Francis's thing. I say, oh. Now, sometimes, again, like part of what the critics of this say is they point out like when AI gives dumb summaries or says things that are wrong, right? But in another way, right, there's an essential human method of reading and summarizing and distilling and thinking, what do I think is the summary of the, and synthesizing and analyzing and all of this process that we just call human thinking and studying,
Mm-hmm.
that now we've replaced. AI does that for me.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes it does it better for me better than I would do, but it's doing it for me, and it's kind of an essential human activity.
Mm.
And I wonder about the same thing.
Beyond what, how a beyond the way in which a human being used to write stuff, but now the printing press. And
Yeah,
okay, it's more essential than that.
yeah, that's, and again, maybe it's always the case with any advance in technology. There's that twofold effect. Like my reach is improved. There's an effect on me, and I lose certain habits.
Uh-huh.
That's those are that happens with every piece of technology.
Hmm.
So it's true with the printing press. We're typing. Yay, I improved. I'm able to type much faster. My reach is improved, but I also lost certain habits.
My reach is improved, but my grasp is weakened.
Yeah, and in fact, when you read people out like free writing or working on creative writing, it's even recommended that sometimes it's good just to write on a blank piece of paper with your hand to generate stuff
Mm-hmm.
because something happens in that process that's different. or in Finding Forrester, I realize increasingly my reference to wisdom comes from 90s movies. But in Finding Forrester, when Sean Connery's talking about like the importance of typing on a typewriter versus on a
On a
keyboard,
word processor.
because the kind of kinetic memory that happens there or something. Okay. Granted. So anytime we get technology, we get this kind of thing. But when
Yep.
we think about thinking or we think about writing with my voice or even creating images, that seems to pertain to a kind of fundamental human activity
Mm-hmm.
that when I outsource it, it's kind of like outsourcing, I don't know, a robot to give my kids hugs for me.
Mm.
Like, oh, my daughter sleeps better if there's a hand patting her to sleep. So I got this robotic hand that kind of mimics my hand and pats her to sleep.
Controlled by an app. You're on an
Yeah, I'm
airplane.
on it. Exactly.
Yeah,
Pat
be
my
like,
daughter to
pat my
sleep. Right.
daughter
Okay.
5 times.
Yeah. Like, okay, maybe it does help my daughter sleep better, but I feel like I've outsourced something that's more integral. And I wonder about that when you're thinking about writing or thinking about thinking or like whether these things are actually they can be outsourced and they can even be kind of effective and we can even argue ourselves into doing it.
Mm-hmm.
But they're a kind of activity proper to our inner life that outsourcing them, one is maybe a kind of a lie. Um, so certainly I feel that way even when I discover like, oh, this great thing I read this great book or this great letter, and it was ghostwritten, and the guy finally wrote and made some edits. I'm like, okay, but all of a sudden there's something. I thought I was having this communion with your mind, and no, you farmed that out to someone else.
Right.
My daughter thinks it's me patting her, and I farmed it out to a machine that imitates my hand.
Mm.
When someone reads my
Even if
writing,
your daughter is fooled, you're
yeah,
saying somehow you've corralled your soul.
yeah. Namely, my daughter is fooled because she thinks it's a real communion with me. And I've given up that aspect of it. So similarly, I read one of your essays. I'm like, wow, Jonathan, it was really great.
Hmm.
This is a really great insight from Jonathan, but it's actually not you.
Hmm.
Like, there was something I thought we were sharing when I was reading your essay. Or you did this work of thinking and
Mm-hmm.
you came to the synthesis of what Francis's teaching meant.
Sure.
Oh, no. You didn't. You read a summary from AI, which
Right.
was a good summary, maybe.
Right. Right.
Right?
Right.
Let's assume it's true. Right. There seems like we've sacrificed something that's an integral operation of ours. I don't know.
Yeah.
It's almost like you lose now and lose in the future because there's something about the heart of a human,
Hmm.
even if their words aren't as good as the AI, there's something about a heart writing. And then there to like also in the future, you're not going to be able to say what you want to say actually because you didn't take the moment and the time now.
We haven't taken the time to sharpen our own ability to articulate and our own originality of thought.
Yeah, sleep out is a love letter. Right. On the one hand, it's a Serrano de Bergerac kind of idea, right?
Hmm.
If you have AI write love letters to your crush, if she falls in love with you, shoot.
I can't keep this up.
Right? Like, or at a certain point, you just know, sort of like, I know if I have to confront my daughter at some point. She's like, I love the fact that you always patting me to sleep. Actually, I don't know. For the first 5 years of your life, I never patted you to sleep. It was the robot hand. There's going to be some psychological rupture that happens here,
You
right?
can't let her know.
Nah, I can't tell her. Similarly, you've wooed a girl with AI. Maybe, you inputted a bunch of your old essays about love into it, but it also wrote what Shakespeare wrote in his sonnets and various things. Your girlfriend thinks she's communing with your soul when she reads those letters,
Hmm.
and then she discovers you didn't write them. What then?
Yeah.
that's a kind of that's terrible. In some sense, it's like the I don't know, creating the avatar fake person to talk to the guy with the porn addiction. Like, I'm not sure we've actually solved the problem.
I don't know much about this. What's the idea? Is
So
that
the idea is that this guy can't actually, he's watching porn, and that's where he gets his arousal. And so therefore, he never interacts with a real girl.
okay?
So the idea is, oh, let's create these avatars, these AI avatars.
To encourage emotional
So there's this
connection
emotional connection.
rather than physical arousal.
Right, right. So now he's connecting with this thing.
Yep.
Okay. So maybe, okay, the other absurdity of it, I'm like, okay, you know, maybe like with drug addiction, sometimes we have to use chemicals to help with, you got to take some drugs to help with your drug addiction. Maybe it's something like that.
Hmm.
But like, no, the real solution is just try to get him to like talk to a girl. And it'll be like really awkward and painful the first time he does it. Sure. But that's really the solution that we're dealing with. Maybe we need some, help here, right? Like the real solution for love letters is to write a love letter to your girl.
And mess it up.
And if you sound like a doofus, okay, you lose her.
Sure.
Write the next girl a love
Yeah,
letter,
you're
right? You go to the bar, your pickup line's trash. Okay, you try it again, right? Like
Yeah.
that's part
You
of
have to iterate.
yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know.
I don't know either. I mean, there's one part of me that says, well, human society has never turned down the GPS in favor of really knowing how to navigate. We haven't turned down knowing how to use hand tools once electrically powered saws came along. Like we seem to have this, as far as I can tell, inability to consider technology and say, well, that wouldn't really be good for us. So let's say nah.
Technological paradigm.
Yeah, so there's part of me that just says, well, history suggests that for good and ill, this is just part of the society we inhabit now. You can opt out, right?
Right.
But you can't get the whole society to say, well, forget this. I can't think of a technology that we had and then walked away from.
It's true. It's true. But here's the thing. Generally with technological adding, two things happen. There's time for society to absorb the changes of habits and the effect that it has on the person,
Hmm.
and to develop new habits that humanize it.
Okay.
Think about the telephone. Telephone was first invented. It's locked into a particular space. It's in the wealthy homes and eventually trickles down. And as it does, certain habits and social norms develop around the use of the phone.
Sure.
Like when it rings, you don't answer it when you're at the dinner table, right? Or if you have to go answer it, you excuse yourself. There's a way of identifying yourself. You sort of potentially you've set up phone booths on the street, which create kind of rituals around the use of it, right? Where you do various things. Not saying we did that perfectly well, but over the course of time that the telephone developed, we as a human society developed ways and habits of how we interact with this person when we have a relationship with the person on the other end of the line and we have a relationship to the people present to us, and how do we balance those? And then the cordless phone came out, and then the cell phone came out, and the ubiquity with which it happened, we couldn't keep up with the norms. We just couldn't, right? I think that's probably true about
Courtesy couldn't keep pace.
yeah, I think it's probably true about the television. We as a society had not fully appreciated the change that television had on us, the things we were giving up before we decided to put it in our pockets. Right? We had not societally grasped the thing. So Plato has this problem in the Phaedrus when he's talking about writing. He tells this myth of the Egyptian gods that created writing, and one Egyptian god's telling the other one, "Hey, I just invented this cool new thing, writing. I'm going to give writing to all the humans, and it's going to be so great. They're going to be able to remember stuff. They're going to be able to communicate things through the generations. It's the shiznit."
Mm.
More or less, putting loosely. Then the other one says, the other God says, no, that's a terrible thing because they're going to lose their habits of memory. They're going to lose these other habits that, the oral traditions and these things by creating writing.
Mm-hmm.
Well, obviously, and then Plato, of course, tells the story in writing. So there's a kind of irony in what's going on. But I think what he's saying is as we adopt new technology, the thing we need to be attentive to is not just the cool new reach we have, but what's the effect on us that it has, and what are the things we lose.
Mm.
And that the faster and faster it develops, the worse and worse we are at that. And we get to AI, and now it can replace not just like, man, it would be great if we had the skill to look at a map. It would be great if we had the skill to like keep track of where we are going when we're hiking
Yeah.
and not just be utterly reliant on my GPS telling me where I am. Now we're in a situation where no, I'm actually outsourcing essential things about what it is to be human. How I communicate love, how I think, how I bear my soul.
Hmm.
We've gotten out of the habit on reflecting on it because the only thing we focus on with technology is the cool new reach I get, not the backward effect, not the habits I lose.
Yes. Huh.
Yep. It's like we might all become mutes.
Yeah. Yeah, that is in fact, right? Like, to focus on pornography. Pornography is actually reduced physical intimacy,
Mm-hmm.
which is bizarre. But no one's talked about that, right? The idea of putting pornography so intensely present to young men so early on means that they're actually just not pursuing physical intimacy. What if this happens with AI? What if we stop thinking? What if we stop writing?
Mm.
What if we talk even less?
Yeah. Yeah.
We'll say my words aren't as good as what could be said, so why even say them?
Yep. Yep. Think about phone calls already, right? Like we already have that, like in something slightly extrinsic. The smartphone is actually terrible for phone conversations.
That's what I've been telling people for so long. I'm like, they came out with all this technology, but the audio quality has never improved.
Yeah, think of what the amount of development we spent on the phone that used to sit, that you could cradle it on your shoulder, it cupped around your mouth, it cupped around your ear, the sound quality, the timbre, all of those things that we were so devoted to with a corded phone. We sort of like blew all that. Like now we got this flat box. It doesn't cup your ear. We're not getting the full range of human timbre. Like it's actually not designed for imitating the personal conversation, which is why everyone texts. 'Cause talking on the phone's terrible.
Huh.
Yeah,
I
and
hadn't thought that.
if
Yeah.
you call someone, they're like, "Why are they calling me?
Why are they calling?
Something must be really important."
Yeah, you didn't text before you called, or you're a sociopath, or there's an emergency, right?
Yeah.
Oh, ain't that the truth? Yeah. Do you ever visit the Chartiers in
I've
in
never visited.
Massachusetts?
No,
They still have rotary phones.
that's
It's the
amazing.
best. Yeah. Yeah. You have to like say it's a very formal thing. You're like Mr. and Mrs. Chartier. I need to use the phone.
Yes.
And if it's a quick call, you can use the phone in the kitchen. But if it's a sensitive call, you go upstairs and you rotary in the number.
That's beautiful.
It
I
is.
love it.
It
I
is.
love it.
There's a
Not
formality to it.
not just because I'm '90s Amish, but because yeah. No, that namely, there's a culture that we have adapted to it,
Hmm.
right? The same reason, like we like eating like with table service versus fast food, is we don't have a culture that's developed with the fact that I can eat a burger while I'm in my car.
Hmm.
There's no ritual for that.
Right. Right.
It's just the efficiency of it. And I've eaten many a burger in the car. So
I think we all have.
We're not knocking that drive-through window.
that's right. That's right.
Yeah.
But we haven't developed it. So again, all right, we lost something. Great, fine. But what if, yeah, we outsource things that we can't get back some other way that are essential to us?
Hmm.
So that's where Francis is saying, at the minimum, Pope Francis says, the undersecretary for the dicastery of culture and education. Sounds like such a Politburo title. Anyway,
Yeah.
they're saying is, okay, so we have to actively develop habits, knowing that technology is trying to push those out.
Wow. Okay. Yeah.
How do we do that?
Right. It's like trying to feed your family in the modern day. You can't just go and buy food. Right. Our grandmothers could just go to the grocery store and buy normal food. And that was healthy. Now we have to read the labels. Right. It's actually there's actually more work required.
Right. Right. In order to get something that's the same thing that your folks used to get when they went to or grandparents used to get when they went to the grocery store.
Exactly.
Yep.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Something they didn't have to think about. Now we have to think about.
Right. And so now maybe we have to develop intensive activities because they don't develop given the habits of the culture.
Sure.
Look me in the eye when you're talking to me.
Mm-hmm.
Speak up, whatever. Every generation has to do this.
Mm-hmm.
But when the adults are figuring out the technology at the same time the kids are figuring out the technology, how do they do this? So Francis says, well, the important thing is literature. Is read literature. Give up the screen and spend time reading literature. Give up the screen and spend time going outside. Give up the screen and spend time forming intentional community. We might add do real philosophy or do real theology, pray, right? But we need to fill and create habits, real habits, habits of free men and women. That even if, as you say, like AI is going to come, there's not a situation where we turn it down.
At least not to my observation of history.
I think that's right. I think that's absolutely right. So what do? We have to create communities where we're intentionally forming habits that can let us use AI well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Have you been following the new administration very closely?
Yes, especially in terms of education.
Yeah. What are your thoughts?
And the stock market.
I got to see where my retirement's going. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. What are the two things everyone's thinking about? Wow, what's like you got the like popcorn experience, like, oh, am I going to be able to buy popcorn experience? Right.
Right.
Both of those things going on. Right. Yeah.
What are your reactions so far?
So education is a really interesting thing. It is a terribly exciting time, because a lot of the things that conservatives have been talking about since Reagan are happening, but they're happening in a kind of a ham-fisted way. But that's because sometimes the changes require congressional action, and we don't have a Congress that's doing that. And so we're having what can the executive do? And we're going to do it. It's kind of a blunt instrument in some ways. I think there's some interesting things about education that we see. So the movement to say we're going to try to reduce as much as possible the Department of Education, we're going to transfer the use of student loans to the Small Business Association, those kind of things. There's certain efficiency gains. I think the other thing, though, that we see is, so in Wyoming Catholic College, when we opted not to take federal money
Mm-hmm.
To participate in even the Title IV programs, part of that we were doing because of what happened in the 80s. In the 80s, the Grove City College didn't take any other federal money except Pell Grants.
This is Grove City in Pennsylvania.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, they only took Pell Grants. And then there was this claim that they needed to comply with Title IX regulation because they took federal money. And so they sued and went all the way to the Supreme Court. And over the course of the lawsuit, the Reagan administration takes over, and the Reagan administration goes before the Supreme Court and they argue. They're like, well, yes, it's true that if you take federal money, you have to comply with federal regulations like Title IX. And they said, but the only thing that you need to comply, the only thing that needs to comply with those federal regulations is the department receiving the funds. And since in Grove City College, the department receiving the federal Pell Grants was the financial aid office, the financial aid office has to be able to demonstrate that they have compliance with Title IX, but the rest of the college doesn't. Well, the Supreme Court votes 6-3. Yeah, that's right.
Clever.
And Congress freaks out. And so Congress passes a bill that, and then overrides Reagan's veto to pass the bill to say that no, if you receive any of federal funds, you have the entire organization needs to comply with, say, for example, Title IX, which is what ultimately drove Grove City to completely opt out of being on the federal funds. But what that shows, right, is that so back there in the late 80s and then into the early 90s, this sense that Congress was, in a sense, weaponizing the legislation associated, especially with the civil rights movement. Weaponizing, I suppose, is a pretty value-laden term for it, but utilizing the legislation,
Employ,
employ the legislation, such that if you took federal money, we could use Civil Rights Act to compel compliance in really effective ways. Okay. And so when Wyoming Catholic College turned down the possibility of participating in federal funding in 2015, the thing we were worried about was under the Obama administration, especially, wow, what could they compel us to do? What could the executive compel us to do if we were on the hook?
Essentially using the precedent set by Congress in the post-Reagan era.
And everyone's like, well, look, that's not really a worry. Like, we're not like, look, there's all sorts of great Catholic colleges that are taking Title IV. This is not an issue. And there's lots of First Amendment protections. You guys should be fine. Well, now what we're seeing is we're seeing Trump, in fact, utilize the civil rights legislation to put the squeeze on some of these big legacy institutions. That's what's justifying him holding up the NIH funding. That's what's justifying various things, restricting funding going to Harvard, restricting funding going to Columbia, restricting funding going to Northwestern, is he's invoking civil rights legislation. He's saying your DEI policies or your anti-Semitism tolerations or various things, those things allow me to say you're in violation of the civil rights legislation from Congress, and we're going to withhold your federal money. And so the Trump administration is actually sort of proving to all of the colleges and universities, yeah, actually, if you're on the hook for federal dollars, you get stuck with the executive's interpretation of the civil rights legislation. And now, currently, if you're a conservative college, you're like, well, I might agree with Trump's interpretation of the civil rights legislation, so maybe that's not so bad. But you also realize Trump's not going to be in power for very long. And when it swings the other way, there's no reason to assume that the next administration is not going to use it for their own interpretation of the civil rights legislation. And so all of a sudden, the fear that we had in 2015 that various folks told us we were being a little bit chicken little about worried about the sky, is actually embodied now 10 years later in Trump.
Even though you're seeing it on the other side.
On the other side. But the fact is, Trump's just pointing out the reality that, yes, if you take federal funds, you are susceptible to the administration's interpretation of civil rights. So I think that's going to radically affect the conversation about federal funding and what that looks like going forward.
Mm-hmm.
So he might be doing like killing two birds with one stone, because now all the bad institutions, like, we don't want federal funding, also kind of bankrupts all their weird programs that they're doing on the side that they shouldn't be doing as a college.
Right.
And at the same time, pulling out of government overreach into the education at the same time.
Now, so what I'd hope, there's two options that come out of this. One option is we get Supreme Court rulings or congressional action that says, no, we're going to protect federal funding of schools and not make it dependent on the whim of the executive who's in charge in their interpretation of civil rights. In which case, we could be in a situation where, like, oh, well, is there a possibility for us to participate in that federal funding? But that seems to be an unlikely outcome. And the more likely outcome is everyone realizes, holy cow, there's a lot of strings associated with federal funding. Maybe we want to get out of that. Maybe we want to figure out other mechanisms for society funding the public good of education that maybe don't open the door for sort of the civil rights legislation and interpretation to dictate the minutia of institutions' governance in such a way.
So whether it floats your boat or sinks your ship, you feel that the tide is running in the direction of high levels of executive branch interpretation of your compliance
Right.
with the standards set by the actions of Congress.
Right. And the reality is that that's been the situation. No one's done anything about it,
Mm.
or they've done it more subtly,
Hmm.
right? Um,
Basically, the free money isn't free.
of course not.
Of course, it never is.
Never was.
Mm.
Never was. Uh, and what the thing is that you're concerned about may differ.
Hmm.
You may be a university that thinks your students should be able to wear like Antifa uh, masks or do Hamas cosplay, dress up stuff, protest and various things. Or you may be a university that thinks, I really don't want guys pretending to be girls to be allowed into the girls' dorm. Uh, but whichever one you are, you're susceptible to the interpretation that the administration has
Ah,
about that. Now, there's an additional protection with First Amendment religious freedom, but it's that itself. I think we're going to see that increasingly be politicized and weaponized as well. Um, Not under the Trump administration, but the can of worms has been opened. So that I think is the first thought. The other concern I have though was this: when Lisa McMahon issued sort of her 4 points as she took over as Secretary of Education. Only the fourth point spoke to the higher ed, and the fourth point said higher education is for the sake of jobs. And so part of that, this conservative movement for the reforming of accreditation bodies is inclined to focus a lot on job placement, ROI, what's the return on investment that you get if you're enrolled in higher education. Um, and what are your graduation rates? What are your retention rates? Those kind of things. And it's trying to break into that a bit.
right.
Right. But it's an interesting question, right? So for an institution like Wyoming Catholic College or some of our peer schools, where we're saying, yeah, we educate a number of young women, and we think that those young women might just be stay-at-home mothers for the rest of their lives. That's going to be really hard to demonstrate an ROI in terms of financial dollar gain.
Unless the nation had such a profound change of heart that
Right.
they thought the raising of children was an investment in the future that you
Right.
can't put a price on.
Which
But
is true.
which is true, but that would be a radical
Right. Right.
change of the nation.
And then even to say to be able to convince the accrediting body, if this becomes a new legislation requirement, that yes, that is you can't put a price on it, but in fact, the mom who's gone through a 4-year liberal arts education is actually really well set up to be a better mom. Like, she could have been a mom without the 4-year liberal arts education and all that student loan debt.
Hmm.
Right. Well, yine. Right. Yes. No.
Yine.
Yeah, right. But this is so I think that's coming down the pike. This could be a real problem. Um, for those of us that are thinking like, yeah, no, we're fine with some of our graduates coming out as stay-at-home moms. We're fine with some of our graduates coming out as contemplative nuns. And not just fine with, but excited with some of our graduates coming out as Catholic priests. Though admittedly their earning potential doesn't seem to have been really enhanced. When they're an ordained diocesan priest, they're not making that much more money than they would have made
Because
if
they
just
went
joined.
here.
Yeah, they'd make more money if they joined a coal mine, right? Um, so that's going to be a real challenge, um, and I think create interesting questions for about what accreditation means or what federal funding means if we start emphasizing this sort of utilitarian approach more.
Okay. So your reaction to the executive branch that's been in power since January is both you agree with some of the resistance it's shown to perhaps extremely progressive institutions, but at the same time, you think in a certain way they they fundamentally agree with those same institutions on the purpose
Yeah.
of this education.
Yeah.
And so you think I like what you're doing, but I don't know that I agree with what you're thinking.
And what are the consequences of that if the principles that are motivating that action are wrong? What's that look like in the end?
Sure. Yeah, it'll be interesting if this administration transitions to a Vance
Right.
administration. That could be very interesting.
Yeah, no, that's going to depend on whether the stock market actually recovers by January of 2026, with all the
Right. Or yeah. Or by
parties.
October of 2020,
Yeah,
2026.
like look, if there's, if things are still chaotic economically, we're not going to be seeing an advanced administration. We're not even going to be seeing a Republican majority in
Mm.
Congress next fall.
Wow. Isn't that interesting? Yeah. Yeah. Right. You take power, you essentially have 600 days to get it done, or else then you lose Congress, and then from there your last 2 years of your administration are a constant battle if you want to get anything done congressionally, and then
Yep,
man, it's a tough situation.
it's a weird world.
Yeah. How has the speaking of coal mines, how has the rise of trade schools changed the Catholic education landscape?
Yeah, so
Are they
some
stealing the young men?
yeah, so I think this in some sense trade schools are a symptom, not a cause.
Okay.
Trade schools have a market because people are already convinced that higher education is bogus.
To get more jobs.
Right. Namely, everyone's like, oh my goodness, like Mikey could just be a plumber, but not have to be surrounded by a bunch of druggies while he's becoming a plumber. Clearly, that's better because the ROI is better. Uh, I was just in a conversation with some high school kids about this. Uh, they were like, "Yeah, why wouldn't I just go apprentice at a good auto mechanic shop and be a good and learn to be an auto mechanic, make money, not have student debt?" That part you can't argue with, right? Like, yeah, it's a good, noble job. You've got a good mentor. Terrific. The only question you have for them is, yeah, so why do you need to apprentice for 2 years to be an auto mechanic? 'Cause it's really complicated. You're working on really complicated machines, and you're doing like an automatic transmission, and like the kind of variance you can deal with that's sometimes smaller than a human hair as you're trying to get like precisely machined and tooled. Like, this is a complex operating thing, and you're going to take other people's cars into your shop, and you need to be able to take care of these multi-thousand-dollar vehicles well. Like, right, of course. But you think as an adult, you'll pick up managing yourself as a human person and your family sort of on the side?
Hmm.
That a human soul is not a very complex thing, that a human person is not a very complex thing, that it doesn't require a lot of reflection and study and training and mentoring to know how to be a good human person? Like, oh, no, I'm going to pick that up by I'll read some books and I'll have some conversations on the side. Like, well, how come you can't do that with auto mechanics? Like, you read a little guide to engines and, talk to mechanics on Sunday after church about how to fix engines. Like, couldn't you be an auto mechanic there? Oh, no, the machine's too complex. Which is not to say, so that's sort of a way of retooling the argument that Socrates gives in Alcibiades, that no, you need to know yourself. You need to know how your soul works, what it is to be a good human person, and that deserves for itself a some devoted study. And if you think it's absurd to think you can pick up being a good auto mechanic from some conversations with good mechanics on the side, you ought also to think it's absurd you'll learn to be a good person from some conversations with mentors on the side.
Not that you would deny anyone that.
Not exactly right. By all means, have good conversations with good, listen to good podcasts, various things on the side. By all means, right? But why we want good Catholic tradesmen? Why do we think that you can devote 2 years principally to trade school
Mm.
and maybe take a couple of ethics classes and that'll be okay? And so God bless these schools that are trying to do that, trying to figure out how to blend, right? The Catholic trade schools are trying to figure out ways to marry like intensive human formation.
Hmm.
But again, it's that question, like,
You've
why?
reintroduced the tension that happens once we accepted having a major.
Yep.
Right. I remember distinctly my brother who was in nursing school and he said, "Yeah, man, I worry a lot more about my exams for my nursing classes than I do for all my gen ed."
Yep.
Right. He's like, "I can write an essay about a book and I can just write an essay and get a B.
Right.
I have to study
Right.
to pass my practicals or whatever the more
Right.
technical class was."
Now I tell these high school kids this is the issue. And they're like, wait, are you saying that liberal arts is soul craft?
Hmm.
They just didn't buy it.
Hmm.
They're like, okay, so I should go to a monastery for a year or something. Why should I do a liberal arts degree?
Right.
That they weren't seeing the connection, which just highlights, again, the thing we were talking about earlier, right? That the de facto assumption we have about education is that it's a formation of intellectual prowess or it's for a job.
Hmm.
We don't think of it as a whole person formation that makes us a better human being.
Mm-hmm. Right. Right. In the way we've all accepted the same premise that McMahon has is that, well, okay, if I'm going to give you these 4 years, then you'd better give me an economic leg up.
Right. And it would be good, since that's why I'm going to college, is for an economic leg up. Maybe I'll be okay with going to a Catholic place to get an economic leg up.
Sure.
But I'm not thinking of I'm going to go do Catholic formation and then maybe I'll get an economic leg up.
Right.
Nah, that's not how we
That's not the calculus.
that's not the horse cart relationship.
Yeah. Man, that's tough. That's really tough. Yeah, because there is a way in which, yeah, if you want to teach cavemen the advantages of having iron tools, you have to give them the experience of using iron tools.
Right.
They have to sort of do it.
It's the problem of education, simply speaking, right? You don't know the good of education until you got it.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. Right. It's like, okay, how can I create this experience when you were in a situation that was messy, but you had the gift of prudence, informed by your study of Achilles and Jane Austen and the betrothed, right? Like, I think I know what to do, and you do know what to do, and you do the thing, and it works out well. But how do you give someone that sense of like, yes, I know how not to stumble?
And then how do you tell them that's worth 4 years of college tuition?
Right. And tens of thousands of dollars. Yeah.
It's a real challenge.
Right.
It's a real
Right.
mess.
Right.
And again, it's not necessarily clear that this is the absolute right model.
Hmm.
Like throughout human history, clearly it's not been essential to get a formation in human virtue to go to 4 years of college education to get it. But it's the model we have.
to impart wisdom.
Where does the 18 to 22-year-old in today's society apprentice themselves to wisdom?
Ah,
And that's the only option.
right.
Like, well, let's brainstorm a completely new way to shift and change the educational structure and environment and paradigms of society. Sure, I'm all for having that conversation.
Right. Do we go back to a feudal system of
Right.
apprenticeship to a
Right.
more experienced like, no, that might be fine.
Right. Well, high school is what? A three-generation experiment. All universal high schools, 3 generations in the US, 4 generations in the US,
Yeah.
where everyone does that. I'm not bashing it necessarily, but like, look, if you want to have this conversation, let's brainstorm how we could do something different. Great. Fine. What I don't love is this idea that, look, I don't need to take that seriously.
Mm.
I can just get a job and I'll pick up how to be a mature, well-formed, wise, Christian, virtuous person as an adult on the side.
Sure. Sure.
It's like
We
you're
under-
making the bricks, and the bricks are teaching you about God. It's like maybe.
Right, right. And you say, well, look, no, I've gained, I went to great Catholic school or great Christian school, great formation, great charter school till I was 18. I don't need to go to this kind of formation college. Like, right, except for the fact that that whole formation is predicated society on the fact that we're forming kids. It's not a formation of adults.
Mhm.
So does it transfer into your adult life? Oh,
To be pretty conscious of it.
yeah, right. Or what's the structure we have in place? So again, I think by all means, so the academic it means like, yeah, let's brainstorm about new utopias or how new ways of doing, new models of doing this.
Right. But in the meantime, I want to impart wisdom to
Right.
this generation
Right.
now.
Right.
Yeah. Yep. And there's the recognition that if you want to impart wisdom, it's going to take time.
Right.
You have to make time for it somewhere.
Right.
You have to.
Yep.
It doesn't just happen by osmosis. Some of it can, but it's going to take time. So your essential argument is like, all right, fine. You want me to do my thing outside of the college structure? All right, I'm open to that. But if you're saying that I have no avenue, I have no deliberate part of the formation in order to do my craft of imparting wisdom, well, then there I have to disagree with you.
Yep.
Because what I do, I believe, is essential.
Right. Right.
And if you want to deny me that, in my eyes, you are saying, let my children grow up without knowing without water.
Right. Right. So then I think, well, look, if we're gonna re-envision what we might do,
Mm-hmm.
um, so the Montessori education model
Mm.
is you do an Erdkinder, very practical trade, almost a trade school kind of education, not quite trade school. It's not quite so solely vocational, right?
Mm-hmm.
But a
But
kind
very
of
physically rooted.
very physically rooted education in your high school years.
Mm-hmm.
So if we become convinced that no, trade school is really important, which I can be pretty convinced of, let's put that in high school. Let's make high school an experience of trade school coupled with some basic reading, writing, grammar, and Catholic formation.
Mm-hmm.
And then when you're 18, using your trade, you work through high school, have a part-time job through college, or work through the summers, have a part-time job through the semesters to pay your way through this apprenticeship in wisdom
Mm.
in college. Why do we assume that no, we're going to put the apprenticeship in wisdom in K-12
Mm-hmm.
and then do trade school in 1822?
Sure.
I don't know. Let's put trades in 14 through 18.
Do you think there's something specifically going on between 18 and 22 cognitively that make the young adult more ready to receive the thing you're trying to bring?
I think in our society, yes.
Okay.
And I don't know why necessarily, right?
Mhm.
It seems pretty clear that an 18-year-old in today's society is capable of entering into philosophical and sustained self-knowledge reflection in a way that maybe was possible when you were 14 or 15 before
Hmm.
in other generations.
Okay.
I'm not 100% convinced on that, right? But I do tend to think of like, look, when marriage was normatively happening when you were a young woman at 15 or 16, like centuries ago, that seems to indicate, at least possibly, that the woman at 16 had a certain life experience and maturity that was radically different than now. I cannot imagine my 16-year-old daughter getting married and becoming a mother now.
Sure.
Biologically, yeah, but not emotionally.
Right, on
Yeah,
other vectors of life
right. Yeah.
experience, you're like, ooh.
Whoa, right? Or, even my grandfather, right? When he was not yet 18, he joined the Navy and went and fought in World War II. He was just over 16 years old.
Mm-hmm.
Holy cow. I
Sure.
mind boggling. Like, was there something different there?
Yeah.
Are we all pansies now? To quote SNL, are we all girly man now, right?
Yeah.
Maybe. I don't know. But it does seem to me that the 18 to 22-year-old is capable of philosophical and self-reflection in a way that a 16-year-old in today's society is not.
Mm-hmm.
But a 16-year-old in today's society seems entirely capable of learning to be a good auto mechanic
Mm-hmm.
or a good HVAC technician.
In fact, at least I know this about young men. Sometimes that's all they can think about.
Yeah.
Right. Like I know a kid, he's 13 or 14. All he can think about is airplanes. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
And you can point to an airplane in the sky and he's be like, yeah, that's probably a Boeing 767. Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Whereas when I've taught Bible studies or, apologetics classes or even logic classes to high school kids, there's a way which I'm just very aware we're kind of play acting,
Mm-hmm.
right? They're not they're repeating the words. They're smart. They're quick, but they're not
Absorbent.
actually absorbing this in the same way.
Mm.
They're mimicking.
Which is not bad.
No, exactly, which is not bad. But if I'm gonna say like, okay, well, should I focus on trying to do more philosophy and deep literature and deep philosophy for these, 14 to 18-year-olds? Or should I give them concrete hard skills and life experience? Like, okay, I'm going to double down on concrete hard skills, life experience,
Mm-hmm.
coupled within a culture that fosters Catholicism and some basic, or Christianity and virtue, uh, and some basic reading, writing, arithmetic skills.
Mm-hmm.
But then when they're 18 to 22, now they're able to reflect.
Okay.
That's at least my experience
Mm-hmm.
in interacting. Does it have to be that way? Could we change things?
Right. In 200 years, could we be doing this at 14? Maybe we could.
Yeah, maybe. Right.
So, wow. But speaking of time,
Yes.
Professor Washut, President Washut, we are out of it. So,
All right.
yeah,
Well, a pleasure.
it's good to have you back, man.
It's great.
Yeah, one of the things we learned this year is that having guests back, right, for a second, third conversation really delivers a level of richness that I think took both of us by surprise.
Yeah, for
Yeah.
sure.
So yeah, it's really good to have you back with us.
And it's always just a pleasure. It doesn't happen enough to
Yeah.
sit and talk
Absolutely.
with you both. So it's
We'll make it happen again.
great. Thank you so much.
Perfect. That's a wrap.
All right.